A peaceful garden hid a fatal trail. Welcome to DetectiveMystery. I am your host, Shadow. Tell me where you're listening from. Your words matter. Let's uncover the truth. St. Cuthbert's in the Wold wore its summer like a well-pressed frock, modest, light, and determined not to show stains. Roses along Church Lane were at their boldest, and the hedges were clipped to such precision that one might imagine the village trimmed away untidy thoughts as well as untidy growth. So nothing ever happens here, Mrs. Bantry was fond of saying, until it does. On the Saturday of the Havisham fete and garden party, nothing had been arranged with particular care. The vicarage lawn held trestled tables of sponge cakes and seed cake, jam tarts and cucumber sandwiches. A raffle offered jars of chutney. Children in starched clothes circled the maypole, waiting for permission to become wild. Near the yew hedge, Colonel Prothero lectured the butcher on discipline and decay. The Miss Jane Marple sat a little apart on a folding chair, a lace parasol shading her mild blue eyes. She appeared merely to rest and to knit, but her attention moved quietly from face to face, unhurried and exact. People spoke more freely when they thought they were speaking past her. Mrs. Havisham, today's hostess, drifted between guests like a ship's captain avoiding reefs. She was sharp-nosed and splendidly certain that her family's old house, the Limes, lent moral improvement to anyone standing upon its grounds. "Do try the lemonade," she told everyone as if offering salvation. "Sicilian lemons. One can taste the difference." Her son, Oliver Havisham, hovered at the edges of conversation, laughing a fraction too late. He was 32, newly returned from London, and wore a linen suit that suggested both money and discomfort. His eyes kept straying, not toward the cakes, but toward the gravel path that ran beside the herbaceous border and disappeared behind the box hedge toward the orchard. He looked like a man awaiting a signal. At the cake table, Grace Bell arranged plates with careful hands. She was Mrs. Havisham's companion, pale and pretty in a quiet way, with hair pinned too tightly and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. MissMarple thought of girls who learned early that silence could be a kind of employment. Constable Pritchard stood near the gate, officially helping. Beside him lingered Dr. Edwin Hart, the village doctor, sunburnt and harassed. Dr. Hart's wife Celia had come too, elegant, bored, and watchful. And there was Mr. Julian Wicks, a visitor renting Rose Cottage for the summer. He was thin, well-dressed, and charming in the way that makes people feel briefly clever for noticing it. Women smiled at him. Men watched him. He bought 2 raffle tickets and said lightly, "So one must invest in local enterprise," and made it sound like a private joke. "Isn't it all delightful?" Mrs. Bantry murmured, lowering herself beside Miss Marple with a sigh that carried several opinions. "So wholesome, and yet, well, you know." Miss Marple's needles clicked. "People are very much the same everywhere," she said gently. "Only the curtains change." She smiled as though at her wool, but her gaze lingered on Grace's tight mouth and Oliver's restless boots at the path, and a burst of laughter rose near the lemonade stand. Too loud, too sudden. Colonel Prothero had made one of his London jokes, and Oliver flushed. Grace Bell's hand jerked. A teaspoon slipped and struck a plate with a sharp clink. Julian Wicks glanced at her, and his smile altered, as though he had seen a door open that ought to have remained shut. At precisely 3 o'clock, Mrs. Havisham tapped her glass. "If everyone would gather, just for a moment." Her eyes searched for the right arrangement of faces. "We shall open the new garden path. My late husband always meant to have it laid properly, and at last it is done. A path says so much about a home. It leads one where one ought to go." There was the appropriate ripple of admiration, and a small procession formed. They followed her past foxgloves and lavender, along the fresh gravel, The new path was edged with bricks and curved behind the box hedge into a green corridor that led toward the orchard. Miss Marple rose more slowly than the others, her parasol bobbing. She noticed Oliver's fingers worrying at his cuff, and Dr. Hart's mouth set as if he expected trouble. She noticed, too, a faint smell beneath the roses. Not perfume, not lemonade. Something metallic, like a coin warmed in a fist. "Here we are," Mrs. Havisham announced, stopping where the path narrowed. A ribbon, neatly tied between two stakes, trembled in the breeze. On the pale gravel just past the first curve lay a pair of white kid gloves, expensive, one finger bent as if pointing. Celia Hart stepped forward first. She took 2 steps, then stopped so abruptly that Mrs. Bantry bumped into her. "Oh," Celia said, her voice suddenly thin. "Oh dear." The hedge seemed to part like lips, and they saw what it had been hiding. Julian Wicks sprawled half on the new bricks, half on the gravel, and a neat, terrible little stream, like a neat, terrible little stream, like a garden path that led, unmistakably, to murder. For a moment, nobody moved, as if the village itself had taken a sharp breath and forgotten how to let it out. Then sound returned in broken pieces. A teacup smashing behind them, Mrs. Havisham strangled Julian. A child's thin cry quickly muffled. A Constable Pritchard lurched into authority. "Stand back, please," he said, stepping around the ribbon stakes with awkward care. He knelt, felt for a pulse, and withdrew his hand. He's gone." Dr. Edwin Hart pushed forward. "Let me." Pritchard yielded. Dr. Hart's fingers were brisk at the wrist, his eyes fixed on the narrow wound at the temple. The blood had already darkened, seeping into the pale stones. "Dead," he said shortly. "Not long." Celia Hart stood very still. My path," she whispered. "Her knees dipped, my path," she whispered. Her knees dipped. Grace Bell caught her elbow and drew her back into the hedge's shade. Grace's face had gone chalk white. Her lips moved as if silently rehearsing an answer. Colonel Prothero cleared his throat. "Pritchard, send for the inspector, at once. And stop these people wandering about." "Yes, sir." Pritchard beckoned a boy by the gate. "Run to the station, fetch Sergeant Willis and tell him to ring Market Basing. Inspector Craddock." The name went through the crowd like a gust. People shifted into little clusters. Mrs. Price from the post office leaned toward the butcher's wife. "I said that London man was trouble," she hissed, "always asking after things. The orchard, for one." "A robbery, then," the butcher's wife decided. "So they'll take your watch for the gold." Miss Marple remained at the edge, parasol lowered, knitting forgotten. Her mild eyes rested first on the body, then on the clean white kid gloves lying just beyond the curve, one finger bent as if pointing deeper into the green passage. "Gloves are often worn for reasons besides the weather," she murmured. Mrs. Bantry hovered near her. Poor Mrs. Havisham, and at her fate. "Yes," said Miss Marple, "except that in real life, the pages do not close when one wishes." Behind them, the fete became a scatter of abandoned manners. Plates of cake left untouched, lemonade sweating in jugs, wasps arriving with ignorant enthusiasm. The vicar stood among the hydrangeas repeating, "Terrible, terrible." Pritchard borrowed rope from the maypole and began, earnestly, to make a boundary no one respected. Grace Bell guided Mrs. Havisham toward the house. "You must sit down, ma'am," she said softly. Mrs. Havisham's eyes were wild. "Who brought him here?" she muttered. "Who invited him?" Grace did not answer. Yet as she passed Miss Marple, her fingers tightened on Mrs. Havisham's arm, and Miss Marple felt, through the thin sleeve, a pulse racing. Dr. Hart wiped his hands on a handkerchief and turned on the nearest bystander. "No one touches anything," he snapped, then saw Miss Marple and lowered his voice. "You ought to sit. This is a shock." "It is always a shock," she said gently. "Ah, dear, but shocks generally have causes." His mouth tightened. Julian had a talent for making causes. His eyes flicked, almost against his will, towards Celia, who was now speaking in low, efficient tones to Colonel Prothero. Miss Marple's gaze slid back to the path. Without crossing the ribbon, she moved a little so that the curve came into view. In the gravel, she could see a scuff. Two impressions close together, one deeper, as if someone had turned sharply, and near the edge of the bricks lay a crushed sprig of rosemary, its scent sharp when she breathed. Oliver Havisham drifted closer, hands thrust into his pockets, his face the color of unbuttered milk. He stared at the blood with a look of private dread. When Mrs. Bantry tried to address him, he flinched. "He wasn't supposed to be here," Oliver said at last. "Not on that path." "Was he meant to be somewhere else?" Miss Marple asked, as though inquiring after a misdelivered parcel. Oliver's eyes darted to hers and away. "I don't know what you mean." "I mean only that people choose places," she said mildly, "and sometimes places are chosen for them." Oliver swallowed. "It could be an accident. He might have fallen." "Perhaps," said Miss Marple, "and yet the gloves are very clean." Something in Oliver's throat made a small choking sound. He stepped back, turning too quickly. As he did, then Miss Marple caught a brief detail, a smear of dark loam on the cuff of his linen sleeve. Rich earth, not the pale grit of the new path. Across the lawn, Celia Hart's voice carried, cool and practical. "Everyone will remain until the inspector arrives. No one is to leave the limes." Miss Marple watched Grace Bell disappear through the French doors with Mrs. Havisham and thought how often the steadiest hands were the ones hiding tremors. She let her parasol tip toward the crushed rosemary, unmarking its place in her mind, and lifted her eyes to the cheerful sunlight as though summer had merely become, for the moment, inconvenient. And somewhere a blackbird sang, unaware of anything. The wait for Inspector Craddock lengthened the afternoon into something strained and brittle. The sun remained absurdly bright, shining upon the white gravel and the thin ribbon that still fluttered between its stakes. No one suggested cutting it now, but the unopened ceremony had acquired a grim finality. Sergeant Willis arrived first from market basing, breathless and officious. He conferred in low tones with Constable Pritchard, then bent over the body with professional gravity. "Blunt force," he muttered to Dr. Hart, indicating the wound at Julian Wick's temple. "Clean strike. Not a fall." "Quite," said Dr. Hart. "There's no stone here sharp enough for that." Willis's gaze traveled the narrow corridor of a hedge. No weapons not in sight. Miss Marple, who had edged nearer again without appearing to do so, observed that the hedge behind the body was slightly bowed inward at one point, as though brushed by a shoulder in haste. A small thread clung to a twig, a pale thread, almost invisible against the leaves. "Best keep them all here," Willis declared. "No one leaves the limes until the inspector speaks with them." A murmur of protest rippled, quickly suppressed. Celia Hart stepped forward smoothly. "Sergeant, perhaps the ladies might wait inside. The heat is considerable." Willis hesitated, then nodded. Inside then, but together. Thus the company migrated from lawn to drawing room in subdued clusters. Teacups were set down untouched. Children were spirited away upstairs. The house, which had that morning been eager to display its polish, now seemed to close around its guests like a fist. Mrs. Havisham lay upon a chaise longue, salts beneath her nose. Grace Bell hovered at her side. She composed once more, though a faint tremor showed in the careful way she folded a handkerchief. Inspector Craddock arrived at last, tall, controlled, with eyes that missed very little. He listened to Sergeant Willis's report, glanced once toward the orchard path through the French doors, and then addressed the room. "I'm sorry to distress you further," he said evenly. "Sir, but I must ask each of you to account for your movements between 2:45 and 3 o'clock. There was a rustle like dry leaves. Colonel Prothero spoke first, indignant and precise. "I was by the lemonade stand with Dr. Hart and Mrs. Hart. We heard Mrs. Havisham call us to the ribbon." Dr. Hart inclined his head. "That is correct." Celia's smile was thin. "I saw Mr. Wicks not 5 minutes before. He was near the hedge, speaking with Miss Bell." Grace started. All eyes turned. It was nothing," she said quickly. "Mr. Wicks merely asked whether Mrs. Havisham required him for the raffle draw." "Did he seem agitated?" the inspector asked. Grace's fingers tightened upon the handkerchief. "He seemed determined." "Determined in what way?" she faltered. "I cannot say." Oliver Havisham, standing near the mantel, shifted his weight. "Julian had been pressing my mother about certain investments," he said abruptly. He had no business doing so." "Investments?" Craddock's voice was mild. "In the orchard," Oliver replied. "Development, cottages. It's nonsense. The land has been in our family for generations." Mrs. Havisham stirred faintly. "Over my dead body," she murmured. Inspector Craddock's eyes flicked to Oliver's cuff, still faintly marked with darker soil. "And where were you, Mr. Havisham?" Oliver swallowed. "On the lawn." "This is near the raffle table." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked once in the silence. "And you, Miss Marple?" the inspector asked courteously. "I was sitting by the yew hedge," she said. "One sees quite a good deal from a low chair, though one is not often consulted." A faint smile touched Craddock's mouth. "I shall consult you, I think." He turned to Celia Hart. "Mrs. Hart?" "I was beside my husband," she replied. "We were discussing a patient. The fate seemed tranquil." Her tone suggested irony. Dr. Hart did not look at her. Craddock's questions moved on, patient and persistent. Each answer seemed reasonable, each left a faint sediment of unease. When he asked about enemies, several villagers mentioned Julian Wicks's charm with a curious emphasis, as if charm itself were a weapon. At last, Craddock stepped aside with Sergeant Willis. Through the open doors, the path gleamed white and accusing, and a constable was already searching the shrubbery beyond the hedge. Miss Marple rose and drifted toward Grace Bell, who stood momentarily alone near a side table. "My dear," she said gently, "rosemary is for remembrance." Grace's eyes widened. "I beg your pardon." "It was crushed near the bricks," Miss Marple continued softly. "One does not tread upon rosemary by accident, unless one is not looking where one goes." Grace's composure slipped for a fraction of a second. "And I know nothing of that." "Of course not," said Miss Marple kindly. "It is only that people so often look at what they fear, rather than at what lies beneath their feet." Across the room, Oliver Havisham was watching them with something perilously close to alarm. And outside, in the hedge that bordered the new garden path, Sergeant Willis's exclamation cut through the air. "Inspector, you'd better see this." Inspector Craddock moved at once toward the French doors, Sergeant Willis already parting the hedge with cautious hands. The guests, held back by Constable Pritchard's anxious authority, craned from the threshold. In the narrow green passage beside the new bricks, Willis had uncovered a heavy garden mallet, the sort used for staking young trees. It lay half hidden beneath the box hedge, its wooden head darkened at one edge. "Found it lodged under the branches, sir," Willis said, as if tossed. Craddock crouched, careful not to disturb the gravel. Well, he examined the mallet without touching it. A faint smear marred the polished wood. A strand of something pale clung to the handle. "Bag it," he said quietly. Dr. Hart, who had followed despite himself, inhaled sharply. "That would account for the wound." "Yes," Craddock replied. "It would." Miss Marple, standing just within the doorway, allowed her eyes to travel not to the mallet, but to the hedge itself. Several leaves were crushed inward at shoulder height, and the gravel beneath showed that same scuffed turn she had noticed earlier. 2 impressions, one deeper, as though a weight had shifted abruptly. Behind her, the room murmured. "A gardener's tool," Colonel Prothero declared. "Anyone could have taken it." "We have no gardener at present," Mrs. Havisham's voice floated weakly from within. "Oliver dismissed him in April." Oliver stiffened. The man was incompetent. Craddock rose and looked toward him. "Where were the tools kept, Mr. Havisham?" "In the potting shed, by the orchard gate." "And was it locked?" Oliver hesitated. Usually. I cannot say whether it was today." Miss Marple noticed that Grace Bell had gone very still again, as though bracing against an internal wind. The inspector returned to the drawing-room, leaving Willis to continue his careful search. "I shall need to speak with each of you individually," he said. "We will begin with Mr. Havisham." Oliver's jaw tightened. She crossed to the mantel and regarded the cross to the mantel and regarded the garden with narrowed eyes. Dr. Hart stood apart, his hands clasped behind his back. Miss Marple resumed her seat, knitting once more, though her mind moved more swiftly than her needles. A mallet from the shed, a path newly laid, a ribbon not yet cut, and Julian Wicks, who had been determined. Mrs. Bantry leaned close. "What do you make of it, Jane?" "My dear," Miss Marple murmured, "when something new is laid down, it often covers something old. One must ask what the path has concealed." At that moment, the morning-room door opened. Oliver emerged flushed and defensive. "I've told him everything," he said too loudly. "Julian was pestering Mother to sell land for cottages. I refused. We argued this week, yes, but I did not strike him." Craddock followed, expression unreadable. "Miss Bell, if you please." Grace rose. Her composure had returned, but a faint sheen of perspiration marked her temple. She disappeared into the morning-room. Celia Hart watched her go with an expression almost speculative. "What did Mr. Wicks want with the orchard?" Celia asked lightly, addressing no one in particular. "Profit," Colonel Prothero replied. "They always do." Dr. Hart spoke unexpectedly. "Julian had mentioned to me that he believed there were irregularities in the Havisham accounts, and he implied, quite unfairly, that Mrs. Havisham might be persuaded to reconsider her position." The room stilled. "Irregularities," Mrs. Bantry echoed. "Nothing concrete?" Dr. Hart said quickly. "Merely gossip." Miss Marple's needles paused. Gossip, she knew, was rarely mere. From the garden came the sound of voices and the measured tread of constables. The body had been covered now. The white gloves remained on the gravel, still curiously pristine. Grace returned sooner than expected, and her eyes were bright, almost feverish. "Well?" Celia asked. Grace shook her head. "I told him what I told you, that Mr. Wicks spoke to me briefly, that he seemed intent upon speaking with Mrs. Havisham privately." "Did he?" Miss Marple inquired gently. Grace's gaze flickered. I believe so." The inspector studied her for a long moment, then turned to Dr. Hart. "Your turn, Doctor." As Dr. Hart passed, Celia's lips curved faintly. It was not a smile, but for a faint crease at the bent finger. She paused near the white gloves, careful not to cross the boundary. They were fine kid leather, spotless except for a faint crease at the bent finger. She noticed that the left glove lay slightly closer to the hedge than the right, as though removed in haste and dropped rather than placed. "Inspector," she called softly. Craddock reappeared at her side. "Yes, and Miss Marple?" "Gloves are generally taken off before one engages in vigorous gardening," she observed, "and yet these appear unworn. I wonder whether Mr. Wicks removed them himself, or whether someone else did." Craddock's eyes sharpened. "You think the gloves significant?" "I think," she replied mildly, "that people sometimes prepare for an encounter, and sometimes they are prepared for." He regarded her thoughtfully. "Thank you." Behind them, Sergeant Willis emerged again from the hedge. and holding something small in an evidence envelope. "Thread caught on the leaves, sir," he said. "Light-colored. Linen, by the look of it." Oliver Havisham's face drained of what little color remained. His hand moved unconsciously toward his cuff. Miss Marple's gaze followed the gesture, then lifted to Oliver's eyes. He looked not at the thread, nor at the mallet, but at the unopened ribbon across the path, as though the true horror lay not in the blood already spilled, but in something that had been meant to happen there and had gone terribly awry. Inspector Craddock took the small envelope from Sergeant Willis and examined the pale thread through its transparent surface. It was fine linen, almost ivory in shade. "Mr. Havisham," he said quietly, "would you mind?" Oliver hesitated only a fraction too long before stepping forward. Craddock's gaze moved from the envelope to the cuff of Oliver's linen jacket. The faint smear of darker soil was still visible, and along the edge of the cuff, a minute fray caught the light. "Hold out your arm, if you please." Oliver complied. Craddock bent closer. A nearly invisible snag marked the seam where a thread might easily have been torn away. "A coincidence," Oliver said, his voice strained. "Half the men here are wearing light suits." "Indeed," Craddock replied, "and we shall examine them all." A low murmur rose behind them. Celia Hart's eyes gleamed with an interest she did not trouble to disguise. Dr. Hart, standing beside her, looked profoundly uncomfortable. Miss Marple observed that Oliver's distress was not of the hot, indignant variety, but of a colder sort, like a man calculating the odds of survival rather than protesting innocence. Yet calculation did not always equal guilt. It sometimes indicated fear of something else entirely. "Inspector," she said gently, "might one consider the direction in which the thread was caught? The hedge boughs inward toward the path, and if someone standing upon the gravel were to reach into the greenery—" Craddock glanced at the hedge, then at her. "You suggest the struggle may have occurred closer to the leaves than the bricks?" "It is only a thought," she replied. "Paths, like conversations, have two sides." Craddock nodded once and turned briskly back to Oliver. "Did you go near the orchard before the ribbon was to be cut?" "No," Oliver said sharply. "I told you, I was by the raffle table. And yet there is soil on your cuff that does not match the pale gravel." Oliver's jaw tightened. "I was in the orchard earlier this morning, inspecting a tree." "Alone?" "Yes." Grace Bell, who had been silent, spoke suddenly. "That is true. I saw him from the breakfast room." All eyes swung to her. "You saw him?" Craddock asked. "Yes, before noon." Her hands twisted together. He was by the far apple trees." Oliver shot her a look that mingled gratitude and warning. Craddock inclined his head. "Thank you, Miss Bell. We shall verify the time." He stepped aside and beckoned Sergeant Willis. "Search the shed thoroughly. I want to know who had access." As Willis departed, Dr. Hart cleared his throat. "Inspector, if I may." The blow was delivered with considerable force. Mr. Wicks was not a slight man. It suggests someone of strength. Celia's eyebrow lifted faintly. "Strength is not solely a masculine attribute, Edwin." "Quite," Craddock said smoothly. "Nor is determination." The word hung between them. Miss Marple's gaze drifted again to the white gloves. Something about their placement troubled her. They lay too neatly, even in disarray, as though meant to be seen. She recalled Oliver's earlier remark. He wasn't supposed to be here, not on that path. Not supposed to be here. "Inspector," she ventured, "was it established who last saw Mr. Wicks alive?" Celia answered before Craddock could. "I did. Near the hedge, perhaps 10 minutes before 3. He appeared, intent upon something within it." "Within the hedge?" Craddock's tone sharpened. "Yes. I assumed he was admiring the landscaping." "Or waiting," Miss Marple said softly. Celia turned to her, eyes cool. Waiting for what, Miss Marple? For someone who did not arrive as expected, she replied. Oliver made an involuntary movement. Craddock noticed. Mr. Havisham, were you due to meet Mr. Wicks privately? No, Oliver said too quickly. Absolutely not. And yet you opposed his plans for the orchard. That is hardly motive for murder. No, Craddock agreed, but it is motive for a meeting. A constable entered, hat in hand. Sir, the potting shed door was unlocked. No sign of forced entry. Several tools missing, though only the mallet has been found. Several, Craddock repeated. Yes, sir. A small spade and a pruning knife are not in their places. A silence followed, more ominous than any outcry. Search the orchard, Craddock ordered. The constable withdrew. Miss Marple folded her knitting carefully. The image in her mind was beginning to settle, not into clarity, but into pattern. A man determined. A meeting implied. Gloves removed. A mallet seized from an unlocked shed. A ribbon awaiting ceremony. And beneath it all, something older. Something the new path had perhaps disturbed. Mrs. Havisham, she said gently, turning toward the chaise longue. When was the path laid? Last week, Mrs. Havisham murmured faintly. The men finished on Thursday. And before that, it was only grass and earth. Miss Marple nodded. Earth disturbed, earth newly covered. Outside, the orchard rustled under the methodical progress of the search. Oliver stood rigid, eyes fixed not on the inspector now, but on the far trees beyond the hedge, as though whatever lay hidden there threatened him more than accusation. Celia Hart followed his gaze with a small, knowing smile. Inspector Craddock observed them both. Until we know more, he said calmly. No one leaves this property. If Mr. Wicks arranged a meeting, I intend to discover with whom and why. Miss Marple inclined her head. She had no doubt that the answer lay not only in the orchard, nor in the shed, but in the subtle turns of speech and glance that had preceded the fatal blow. People prepared paths for many reasons, and sometimes, when a path was laid, it revealed precisely where someone had hoped to bury the truth. The search of the orchard did not take long to yield its next unease. A constable's whistle sounded, short, sharp, and Inspector Craddock moved at once through the hedge, Miss Marple following at a discreet distance. Beneath one of the older apple trees, where the grass grew thin and the soil showed pale through recent disturbance, the constable stood pointing downward. The earth there was uneven, as though hastily tamped. Beside it lay a small spade, its blade dark with fresh clay. Found it half buried, sir, the constable reported. As if someone changed their mind. Craddock crouched and examined the ground without touching it. Dig carefully, he instructed. The constable knelt and began to remove the loose soil, and after only a few inches, his spade struck something hard. He scraped gently, revealing the corner of a metal box, old-fashioned with a rusted clasp. Mrs. Havisham, who had insisted upon being helped as far as the orchard gate, uttered a faint cry. That was my husband's, she said. He kept deeds in it, old papers. Craddock glanced up. You knew it was here? No, it was in his study for years. After he died, I had things moved. I never saw it again. The box was lifted free and set upon the grass. Craddock opened it with some effort. Inside lay a sheaf of folded documents tied with fading ribbon. Oliver had followed despite instructions. His face, already strained, seemed to collapse inward. That shouldn't be there, he whispered. Shouldn't it? Celia Hart asked softly from behind him. Craddock unfolded the top document. His eyes moved swiftly. Deeds, he confirmed. Portions of the orchard, or mortgaged some years ago. Mrs. Havisham stared. That is impossible. On the contrary, Craddock said evenly, it appears quite possible. Oliver stepped forward. That mortgage was temporary. Father resolved it. Did he? Craddock's tone was neutral. A second document slipped from the bundle, a recent letter, its paper still crisp. Craddock scanned it, then looked up sharply. "From Mr. Julian Wicks," he said. "Dated 3 days ago." A tremor passed through the gathered figures. "What does it say?" Dr. Hart asked. "That he had discovered certain discrepancies in the title of this land," Craddock replied. "That unless matters were clarified, he would feel compelled to bring them to the attention of interested parties." "Blackmail," Colonel Prothero muttered. "Or leverage," Celia suggested. Oliver's hands clenched. He had no right. "No right to what?" MissMarple asked gently. "To meddle," Oliver snapped, then faltered under Craddock's steady gaze. Craddock folded the letter carefully. "Mr. Havisham, were you aware that the orchard was not entirely unencumbered?" Oliver's silence was answer enough. Mrs. Havisham swayed. Grace Bell moved swiftly to support her. "You knew," Mrs. Havisham whispered to her son. "You said everything was settled." "I was settling it," Oliver insisted hoarsely. "Julian exaggerated. He wanted Mother to panic, so she'd sell." "And if she refused?" Craddock asked. Oliver looked away, yet MissMarple's eyes rested not on Oliver now, but on Grace. The younger woman's expression held something more complex than shock, something like dread long anticipated. "Inspector," MissMarple said thoughtfully, "if Mr. Wicks wished to confront Mr. Havisham with this discovery, the new path would provide a private approach from the lawn. Convenient for a discreet meeting." Craddock inclined his head. "A meeting to discuss deeds buried beneath fresh gravel." "And perhaps," MissMarple added softly, "to suggest that what is buried may be unearthed." Oliver's breath came unevenly. "You think I killed him for that?" "I think," Craddock replied, "that you had reason to wish him silent." Before Oliver could answer, Sergeant Willis reappeared from the far end of the orchard, holding something wrapped in cloth. "Found near the boundary hedge, sir. Pruning knife." He unwrapped it. MissMarple considered the pattern forming. "Not our murder weapon," Dr. Hart said quickly. "No," Craddock agreed. "But it suggests haste, tools taken, discarded." MissMarple considered the pattern forming before her. A mallet used in sudden violence, a spade to conceal what had been hidden, a knife abandoned without use. It was a sequence not of careful premeditation, but of interruption. "Inspector," she said quietly. "The gloves." Craddock looked at her. If Mr. Wicks came prepared to handle papers, perhaps even to remove them, he might well have worn gloves, to avoid leaving prints upon something he meant to take. Craddock's eyes flicked to the metal box. "But the gloves were removed," she continued, "and left conspicuously upon the path, which suggests that something occurred between his arrival and his intended action." "A struggle," Craddock said. "Or an argument," MissMarple replied. Oliver closed his eyes briefly, and Celia Hart watched him with narrowed interest. "You arranged to meet him, didn't you?" she said suddenly. "To persuade him to relinquish those papers." Oliver's head snapped up. "No, but you feared he would expose the mortgage." "That was my affair." "And now it is everyone's," she returned coolly. Craddock straightened. "Mr. Havisham, you will accompany me inside." As they moved back toward the house, MissMarple lingered a moment by the disturbed earth. She noted the depth at which the box had lain. Shallow, too shallow for long concealment. It had not been buried years ago. It had been placed there recently. Very recently. She glanced toward Grace Bell, who stood pale but resolute beside Mrs. Havisham. Sometimes, MissMarple reflected, it was not the one who feared exposure most who acted, but the one who feared its consequences for someone else. And the orchard, once intended as the root of profit, and had instead become the root of something far more dangerous. Inside the morning room, Inspector Craddock closed the door with deliberate care. The murmur from the orchard faded, leaving a strained stillness between himself and Oliver Havisham. "You understand?" Craddock began evenly, "that the discovery of those deeds alters the complexion of this matter." Oliver stood rigid by the window, staring out toward the hedge as though the orchard might rearrange itself if he looked long enough. "Julian was bluffing," he said at last. "He'd only just found out about the mortgage." "How had he found out?" "I don't know." Craddock waited. Oliver's shoulders sagged a fraction. "He was always prying, asking about the orchard, about Father's affairs." "And you agreed to meet him this afternoon?" Oliver's silence stretched too long. "Yes," he said finally, "but only to reason with him, to explain that selling was impossible." "On the new path?" "It was secluded." "And symbolic," Craddock suggested quietly. Oliver's mouth tightened. "You think I chose the spot to make a point?" "I think," Craddock replied, "that people often choose ground that favors them." Oliver turned sharply. "I did not strike him." "Tell me what happened." Oliver swallowed. "He was already there when I arrived, standing by the hedge. He said he knew about the mortgage, and that Mother could be persuaded to sell if the right pressures were applied." "Blackmail." "Yes, and you lost your temper." "I told him to leave." "Did he?" He laughed. Craddock watched him carefully. "And then?" Oliver hesitated. "We argued." He stepped back toward the hedge. "I thought he was going to retrieve something." "The deeds?" "I don't know." He reached behind him. Craddock's gaze sharpened. "And?" "I heard someone behind the hedge. A rustle. I turned, only for a second. When I looked back, Julian was on the ground." Craddock did not move. "You expect me to believe a third party struck him while you conveniently looked away?" "It's the truth." "Why not raise the alarm immediately?" Oliver's face flushed. "Because I knew what it would look like. I panicked. I saw the mallet by the hedge, and I realized what had happened, or what it would seem to be." "So you left him there?" "Yes." "And the gloves?" "I don't know about the gloves." Craddock studied him for a long moment, then opened the door. "Miss Bell, if you please." Grace entered, pale but composed. "You heard Mr. Havisham earlier," Craddock said. "Did you know of this meeting?" Grace clasped her hands. "Yes." Oliver's head snapped toward her. "Grace, you asked me to tell no one," she said quietly. But I cannot allow you to stand alone under suspicion." Craddock inclined his head. "You were aware of the mortgage?" Grace nodded. "Mr. Havisham confided in me. He meant to resolve it before Mrs. Havisham learned the truth." "And Mr. Wicks?" "He discovered it by chance. He hinted at it to me 2 days ago." "Hinted how?" "He said secrets rarely remain buried, especially when new paths are laid." Craddock's eyes flickered briefly. "Did you meet him today?" Grace hesitated. "Yes." Oliver stared at her. "You told me you wouldn't." "I met him briefly," she continued, her voice steady despite the tremor in her fingers. "I begged him to reconsider, to give Oliver time." "Where did this conversation occur?" "Near the hedge." "Shortly before 3? "Yes." "Did you leave him there?" "I did." "And then?" "I returned to the lawn." Craddock regarded her thoughtfully. "You did not hear a struggle?" "No." Miss Marple, who had been permitted to remain by tacit consent, spoke gently. "My dear, when you passed through the hedge, did you brush against it?" Grace blinked. I suppose I might have." "Your sleeve is of pale linen," Miss Marple observed, "not unlike Mr. Havisham's." Grace's gaze dropped to her own cuff. A faint fray marked its seam. Oliver's breath caught. Craddock stepped closer. "You are closer to the hedge than you have admitted, Miss Bell." Grace's composure faltered at last. "He would have ruined them," she whispered. "Mrs. Havisham is not strong. The shock—" "So you struck him?" Craddock asked quietly. "No." She shook her head violently. "I did not." "Then what happened?" Grace's eyes filled, but her voice remained controlled. When I left him, he was angry. He said if Oliver would not persuade his mother, he would. I feared he meant to tell her immediately. I circled back through the orchard to see if he had gone. I heard voices, raised, then a cry. Whose cry? Craddock pressed. I don't know. And when you reached the path, he was already on the ground. Oliver was standing there. Oliver's face had gone ashen. I told you. I had turned away. Miss Marple's gaze moved slowly between them. Two young people, bound by anxiety and secrecy. Yet beneath their fear lay something else, something unsaid. Inspector, she said softly, it seems we have three presences upon that path. Mr. Wicks, Mr. Havisham, and Miss Bell. And yet the blow may have come from a fourth direction entirely. Craddock's brow furrowed. The hedge bows inward, she continued, as though someone within it leaned forward, not outward. If one stood concealed among the leaves, one might strike unseen. A silence followed. Celia Hart's voice drifted from the doorway, cool and deliberate. But who, Miss Marple, would have reason to conceal themselves there? Miss Marple turned her mild gaze upon her. That, my dear Mrs. Hart, was precisely what we must consider. And for the first time since the orchard had yielded its buried secret, a new possibility settled over the room, one that shifted suspicion away from the obvious and toward the shadows between the leaves. Celia Hart stepped fully into the morning room, closing the door behind her with a quiet, decisive click. The faint sounds from the orchard and drawing room were shut out, leaving only the four of them in a tightening circle of attention. You suggest, she said lightly to Miss Marple, that someone concealed themselves in the hedge like a character from a penny melodrama? I suggest, Miss Marple replied gently, that hedges are remarkably accommodating. Children hide in them frequently. So do those who wish to overhear. Inspector Craddock's gaze moved to Celia. Mrs. Hart, where were you precisely between 2:45 and 3? On the lawn, as I have already said, as with my husband and Colonel Prothero. Did you leave them at any point? Celia smiled faintly. Inspector, you make it sound as though I slipped away to lurk among shrubs. Did you? Her eyes held his. No. Dr. Hart, who had entered unnoticed behind her, spoke stiffly. Celia remained beside me. Miss Marple observed the doctor's posture, rigid, defensive. His wife did not look at him. Craddock folded his arms. Mrs. Hart, you said earlier you saw Mr. Wicks near the hedge, intent upon something within it. Yes. Did you see anyone else there? No. Miss Marple's knitting lay forgotten in her lap. And yet you described him as intent upon something within the hedge, she said softly. One does not peer into greenery without reason. Celia's expression sharpened. Perhaps he was looking for the box, if he had discovered it was buried there. Huh? Said Miss Marple. You knew of the box? A flicker, almost imperceptible, passed across Celia's face. And I deduced it when it was unearthed, like everyone else. Indeed. Miss Marple's tone was mild. I find it curious that you leapt so quickly to the conclusion that Mr. Wicks might have been seeking it. Craddock's eyes narrowed slightly. Celia gave a short laugh. Surely that is obvious. The orchard, the mortgage, the buried deeds. Buried recently, Miss Marple interjected. Yes, Celia agreed. Recently. Oliver stared at her. How would you know that? The room stilled. Celia met his gaze coolly. Because the soil was pale and loose. Anyone could see that. Miss Marple tilted her head. But most people would assume the box had lain there for years. You did not. A silence fell, heavy and charged. Craddock spoke quietly. Mrs. Hart, had you any private conversation with Mr. Wicks in the days preceding his death? Dr. Hart shifted. Celia. Yes, Celia said calmly. He dined with us on Thursday, and he mentioned the orchard. He seemed amused by what he had learned. Amused? Craddock echoed. He enjoyed leverage, Celia said. It made him feel powerful. Miss Marple's eyes rested on her thoughtfully. And did he possess any leverage over you, Mrs. Hart? Celia's composure faltered for the briefest instant. No. Dr. Hart's hands clenched behind his back. Inspector, Miss Marple said gently, may I inquire whether Mr. Wicks had business interests beyond the orchard? Investments, perhaps, not in market basing? Craddock nodded slowly. He was involved in several speculative ventures. Some successful, Celia added, some less so. Did any involve your husband? Miss Marple asked. Dr. Hart looked as though he had been struck. No. Celia's gaze flicked toward him. Edwin invested modestly in one of Julian's schemes last year, she said coolly. It did not prosper. You told me it was secure, Dr. Hart said hoarsely. It was, Celia replied, until it wasn't. Craddock's attention sharpened. Did Mr. Wicks threaten to expose this failed investment? Celia's chin lifted. He hinted that Edwin had been optimistic with certain patients regarding his finances. Dr. Hart's face went grey. That is not true. It is what Julian suggested, Celia said evenly. He implied that a whisper in the right ear could damage Edwin's reputation. Miss Marple folded her hands. So, Mr. Wicks held leverage over both the Havishams and the Harts, and perhaps over others, Craddock added. Oliver looked bewildered. Why would he risk confronting us so openly? Because he believed himself untouchable, Celia said. He always did. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on her. There was no grief in her tone, only a faint, hard satisfaction. Mrs. Hart, she said softly, when you stood upon the lawn, did you at any time lose sight of Mr. Wicks after observing him at the hedge? Celia hesitated. Only briefly. How briefly? A minute, perhaps 2. And in that minute, Miss Marple continued gently, it would have been possible to approach the hedge unseen from the far side of the orchard. Celia's eyes flashed. You imply? I imply nothing, Miss Marple said serenely. I merely consider how easily one might move if one were determined. Dr. Hart took an unsteady step. Celia, you did not. She rounded on him. Do not be absurd. Craddock's voice cut cleanly through the rising tension. Mrs. Hart, would you consent to my examining your gloves? A stillness fell like a dropped curtain. Celia's smile returned, but it no longer reached her eyes. Of course. She removed them slowly, laying them upon the table. They were pale kid leather, like the pair upon the path. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. Those are not the gloves you wore earlier. Celia's hand paused. You changed them, Miss Marple said softly. The pair upon the path are smaller. Oliver's breath caught. Craddock's gaze sharpened to a point. Mrs. Hart? Celia's composure wavered for the first time in earnest. Many women own similar gloves. Yes, Miss Marple agreed gently, but not many leave them behind in a place where blood is about to fall. The silence that followed was no longer speculative. It was expectant, and in that silence, the image of the hedge, bowed inward, so concealing more than leaves, seemed to shift from possibility to accusation. Inspector Craddock did not look away from Celia Hart. The pale gloves upon the table lay between them like a quiet accusation. You are quite right, he said evenly to Miss Marple. The gloves found on the path were smaller than these. Celia's composure gathered itself again, though something brittle had entered her voice. Inspector, are we to measure every lady's glove in the county? If necessary, Craddock replied. Dr. Hart stared at his wife as though seeing her from a great distance. Celia, tell them. There is nothing to tell, she said sharply. Miss Marple rose slowly, her manner as mild as ever. My dear Mrs. Hart, the difficulty with gloves is that they are worn to prevent the leaving of traces. When one pair is removed and another donned, it suggests forethought. Celia's eyes flashed. You weave fancies on Miss Marple. Not fancies, Miss Marple said gently. Patterns. She turned to Inspector Craddock. If I may, I believe the sequence unfolded thus. Mr. Wicks arranged to confront Mr. Havisham upon the new path. He came prepared to retrieve the buried deeds, hence the gloves. Miss Bell, aware of the meeting, attempted to dissuade him and left. Mr. Havisham arrived, they argued. Meanwhile, someone else, already in possession of deeper grievance, concealed themselves within the hedge. Celia laughed, but the sound rang hollow. And you assign that role to me? I assign it, Miss Marple replied softly, to the person with the most to lose. Dr. Hart closed his eyes briefly. Julian Wicks, Miss Marple continued, held leverage not only over the Havishams, but over you and your husband, a failed investment, suggestions of professional impropriety. Such whispers could have ruined Dr. Hart. Celia's hands clenched at her sides. You dined with Mr. Wicks on Thursday, Miss Marple went on. You learned of the buried deeds, perhaps even where they were hidden. You observed the new path and realized it offered a secluded stage. And when you saw Mr. Wicks lingering by the hedge today, you understood that he intended to act. Speculation, Celia said. But her voice had thinned. You left the lawn briefly, Miss Marple said. No one watched you constantly. You circled through the orchard, entered the hedge from the far side, and waited. When Mr. Wicks turned from Mr. Havisham, when Oliver looked away, you struck. Oliver made a choking sound. The mallet, Miss Marple said quietly, was seized from the shed earlier and concealed. The blow was swift. Mr. Havisham, startled, saw only the aftermath. In his panic, he fled. You removed Mr. Wicks's gloves to suggest he had prepared something illicit, and in your haste left them upon the gravel. Celia's breathing had quickened. The thread caught in the hedge, Miss Marple added, may not belong to Mr. Havisham at all. Linen frays easily, and one cuff, Inspector, may be trimmed before it is examined. Craddock's gaze dropped to Celia's sleeve. A tiny, freshly snipped edge betrayed recent alteration. Dr. Hart stared at it in dawning horror. Celia, he would have destroyed you, she said suddenly, her voice breaking free of restraint. Do you not understand? Julian would have whispered. She hinted. Your patients would have doubted you. Everything you built, gone. So you killed him, Craddock said quietly. I protected my husband, she retorted fiercely. I will not apologize for that. A silence followed, thick and irrevocable. You struck him while he faced Oliver, Craddock continued. You relied upon the confusion of accusation. You expected suspicion to fall upon the son defending his mother's estate. Celia's shoulders sagged, the last of her defiance ebbing. He thought himself invincible, she murmured. Always smiling, always certain he could bend others. Dr. Hart sank into a chair, his face ashen. You should have told me. And watched you crumble, she replied bitterly. No. Miss Marple regarded her with quiet sadness. You see, my dear, the tragedy lies not only in the act, but in the belief that one must act alone. Inspector Craddock stepped forward. Mrs. Hart, I must ask you to come with me. Celia straightened. It again, she said softly. Dr. Hart did it again, she said softly. Dr. Hart did not answer. Craddock escorted her from the room. The door closed with a subdued finality. Oliver exhaled shakily. Grace moved toward him, relief and grief mingling upon her face. It was never about the orchard, Oliver whispered. No, Miss Marple agreed gently. It rarely is. Land, money, reputation, these are merely the soil, and it is fear that takes root. Outside, the sun had begun its slow descent, casting longer shadows across the new path. The ribbon still fluttered, uncut, above the place where blood had darkened the stones. Mrs. Havisham, pale but composed, was helped to the window. She looked out at her immaculate garden, altered forever. Miss Marple gathered her knitting and moved quietly toward the door. The village would talk, as villages always did. Speculation would bloom and wither in turn. But beneath it all, life would resume its careful trimming of hedges and brewing of tea. Only the path would remain, a pale reminder that what is newly laid may conceal old anxieties, and that the smallest rustle in a hedge can change the course of many lives. In the days that followed, St. Cuthbert's in the Wold performed its peculiar ritual of recovery. Curtains twitched with renewed purpose. Voices lowered when Dr. Hart's name was mentioned. The fet bunting was taken down, folded carefully, and put away as though it might yet be needed in a kinder season. Celia Hart had made a full confession at the station in Market Basing. It was not hysterical, nor was it reluctant. She described the mallet taken earlier from the shed and hidden in the hedge, the moment she saw Julian Wicks glance toward the buried box. The swift calculation that if he exposed both the mortgage and her husband's vulnerable finances, 2 households would suffer ruin. "I believed," she had said, "that I was 100% sure, that 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 I was 100% sure that I was one. I believed, she had said, that I was pruning diseased growth. Inspector Craddock had listened without comment. Motive did not soften fact. Yet it was Miss Marple who, on a quiet afternoon a week later, completed the pattern in the drawing room at the Limes. Mrs. Havisham, pale but steadier, had invited her for tea. Oliver and Grace sat nearby, chastened and subdued. "It is a mercy," Mrs. Havisham murmured, "that the truth is known, though it feels no mercy." Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. Truth rarely feels like mercy at first. It feels more like cold water. Oliver leaned forward. "I keep thinking, if I had faced Julian properly, if I had told Mother about the mortgage sooner." "Secrets," Miss Marple said gently, "what invite strangers into one's hedges." Grace's hand found Oliver's. She had given her own statement clearly, admitting her meeting with Julian and her fear for Oliver's reputation. It was her candor that had forced Celia's miscalculations into light. Mrs. Havisham sighed. "I had believed the path a symbol of renewal. Instead, it revealed what was already there," Miss Marple finished softly. "Fresh gravel does not create unease, and it merely fails to hide it." Inspector Craddock arrived shortly thereafter, hat in hand. "I thought you might wish to hear the final details," he said. They listened in stillness. "The thread from the hedge," he explained, "did not match Mr. Havisham's suit after all. His cuff had frayed earlier that morning while moving a crate in the orchard. Miss Bell's testimony confirmed it. Mrs. Hart had trimmed her own sleeve later, but not perfectly. Under magnification, The fibers matched those caught in the leaves. Oliver exhaled slowly. The gloves, Craddock continued, were purchased in market basing last month. Mrs. Hart admitted buying 2 identical pairs. One was found on the path, the other in her wardrobe. Mrs. Havisham closed her eyes briefly. "And the box?" she asked. "Buried 3 days before the fete," Craddock replied. "Mrs. Hart had discovered it among old effects when visiting you. She placed it in the orchard to ensure Mr. The Wicks would find it, thereby confirming his suspicions and hastening confrontation." A faint shudder passed through the room. "She orchestrated the setting," MissMarple observed quietly. "But not the panic. That belonged to others." Craddock inclined his head. "Indeed." When he had gone, silence settled once more. "It was fear," Grace whispered. "Not greed." "Yes," MissMarple agreed. "Fear of disgrace, fear of loss, fear that love requires desperate measures." "Mrs. Refrain from burying what ought to be, refrain from burying what ought to be spoken." In time, the orchard would bear fruit again. The mortgage would be settled openly. Oliver had already begun negotiations, this time with transparency. Dr. Hart, though wounded in pride and trust, would continue his practice. Villagers, after much discussion, would accept that even in St. Cuthbert's in the Wold, darkness could grow beneath neat hedges. As for the path, Mrs. Havisham chose not to remove it. The ribbon was finally cut on a subdued morning with no audience but family. It no longer symbolized triumph, but endurance. MissMarple, walking home beneath a sky turning gold with evening, reflected as she often did on the constancy of human nature. Villages changed their paving stones and trimmed their shrubs, but envy, fear, pride, and devotion remained perennial. She paused briefly by her own modest gate and considered the roses climbing there. One must prune carefully, she thought, not to destroy, but to guide. To cut blindly was to wound what one meant to save. Behind her, St. Cuthbert's settled into twilight. The garden path at the limes lay quiet and pale, no longer a stage for deception, but a reminder that even the most orderly landscape may conceal unrest. And MissMarple, serene and observant, carried with her the quiet knowledge that truth, once uncovered, was itself a kind of tending, gentle, patient, and, in its way, merciful.